Thank you very much, Dr. Rice. I appreciate your statement, your attendance, and your service. I have a couple of questions. As we understand it, when you first came into office, you've just been through a very difficult campaign. In that campaign, neither the president nor his opponent, at the best of my knowledge, ever mentioned al-Qaeda. There have been almost no congressional action or hearings about al-Qaeda. Very little bit in the newspapers, and yet you walk in and Dick Clark is talking about al-Qaeda should be our #1 priority. Sandy Berger tells you you'll be spending more time on that than anything else. What did you think and what did you tell the president as you hit that kind of, I suppose, new information for you?
Well, in fact, Mr. Chairman, it was not new information. I think we all knew about the 1998 bombings. We knew that there was speculation that the 2000 Cole attack was al-Qaeda. There had been, I think, documentaries about Osama bin Laden. I myself had written for an introduction to a volume on bioterrorism done at Stanford that I thought that we wanted not to wake up one day and find that Osama bin Laden had succeeded on our soil. It was on the radar screen of any person who studied or worked in the international security field. But there's no doubt that I think the briefing by Dick Clark, the earlier briefing during the transition by Director Tenet, and of course what we talked with about Sandy Berger, it gave you a heightened sense of the problem and a sense that this was something that the United States had to deal with. I have to say that, of course, there were other priorities, and indeed in the briefings with the Clinton administration, they emphasized other priorities. North Korea, the Middle East, the Balkans. One doesn't have the luxury of dealing only with one issue if you are the United States of America. There are many urgent and important issues. But we all had a strong sense that this was a very crucial issue. The question was, what do you then do about it? And the decision that we made was to, first of all, have no drop-off in what the Clinton administration was doing, because clearly they had done a lot of work to deal with this very important priority. And so we kept the counterterrorism team on board. We knew that George Tenet was there. We had the comfort of knowing that Louis Freeh was there. And then we set out. I talked to Dick Clark almost immediately after his, or I should say shortly after his memo to me saying that al-Qaeda was a major threat. We set out to try and craft a better strategy, but we were quite cognizant of this group, of the fact that something had to be done. I do think early on in these discussions, we asked a lot of questions about whether Osama bin Laden himself ought to be so much the target of interest, or what was that going to do to the organization if in fact he was put out of commission. And I remember very well the director saying to President Bush, well, it would help, but it would not stop attacks by al-Qaeda nor destroy the network.
I've got a question now I'd like to ask you. It's given me by a number of members of the families. Did you ever see or hear from the FBI, from the CIA, from any other intelligence agency, any memos or discussions or anything else between the time you got into office and 9/11 that talked about using planes as bombs?
Let me address this question because it has been on the table. I think that concern about what I might have known or we might have known was provoked by some statements that I made in a press conference. I was in a press conference to try and describe the August 6th memo, which I've talked about here in my opening remarks, and which I talked about with you in the private session. And I said at one point that this was a historical memo, that it was not based on new threat information, and I said no one could have imagined them taking a plane, slamming it into the Pentagon, I'm paraphrasing now, into the World Trade Center, using planes as a missile. As I said to you in the private session, I probably should have said I could have not imagined, because within 2 days, people started to come to me and say, oh, but there were these reports in 1998 and 1999. The intelligence community did look at information about this. To the best of my knowledge, Mr. Chairman, this kind of analysis about the use of airplanes as weapons actually was never briefed to us. I cannot tell you that there might not have been a report here or a report there that reached somebody in our midst. Part of the problem is, and I think Sandy Berger made this point, that when he was asked the same question, that you have thousands of pieces of information, car bombs and this method and that method, and you have to depend to a certain degree on the intelligence agencies to sort, to tell you what is actually relevant, what is actually based on sound sources, what is speculative. And I can only assume or believe that that perhaps the intelligence agencies thought that the sourcing was speculative. All that I can tell you is that it was not in the August 6th memo using planes as a weapon, and I do not remember any reports to us, a kind of strategic warning that planes might be used as a weapon. In fact, there were some reports done in 98 and 99. I think I was certainly not aware of them at the time that I spoke.
You didn't see any memos to you or any documents to you?
No, I did not.
Some Americans have wondered whether you or the President worried too much about Iraq in the days after the 9/11 attack, and perhaps not enough about the fight ahead against al-Qaeda. We know that at the Camp David meeting on the weekend of September 15th and 16th, the President rejected the idea of immediate action against Iraq. Others have told that the President decided Afghanistan had to come first. We also know that even after those Camp David meetings, the administration was still readying plans for possible action against Iraq. So can you help us understand where in those early days after 9/11 the administration placed Iraq in the strategy for responding to the attack?
Certainly. Let me start with the period in which you're trying to figure out who did this to you. And I think given our exceedingly hostile relationship with Iraq at the time, this is, after all, a place that had tried to assassinate an American president, was still shooting at our planes in the no-fly zone. It was a reasonable question to ask whether indeed Iraq might have been behind this. I remember later on in a conversation with Prime Minister Blair, President Bush also said that he wondered, could it have been Iran, because the attack was so sophisticated? Was this really just a network that had done this? When we got to Camp David, and let me just be very clear, in the days between September 11th and getting to Camp David, I was with the President a lot. I know what was on his mind. What was on his mind was follow-on attacks, trying to reassure the American people. He virtually badgered poor Larry Lindsey about when could we get Wall Street back up and running, because he didn't want them to have succeeded against our financial system. We were concerned about air security, and he worked very hard on trying to get particularly Reagan reopened. So there was a lot on our minds. But by the time that we got to Camp David and began to plan for what we would do in response, what was rolled out on the table was Afghanistan, a map of Afghanistan. And I will tell you, that was a daunting enough task to figure out how to avoid some of the pitfalls that great powers had in Afghanistan, most recently the Soviet Union and, of course, the British before that. There was a discussion of Iraq. I think it was raised by Don Rumsfeld. It was pressed a bit by Paul Wolfowitz. Given that this was a global war on terror, should we look not just at Afghanistan, but should we look at doing something against Iraq? There was a discussion of that. The President listened to all of his advisors. I can tell you that when he went around the table and asked his advisors what he should do, not a single one of his principal advisors advised doing anything against Iraq. It was all to Afghanistan. When I got back to the White House with the President, he laid out for me what he wanted to do. And one of the points, after a long list of things about Afghanistan, a long list of things about protecting the homeland, the President said that he wanted contingency plans against Iraq should Iraq act against our interests. There was a kind of concern that they might try and take advantage of us in that period. We were still flying no-fly zones, and there was also, he said, in case we find that they were behind 9/11, we should have contingency plans. But this was not along the lines of what later was discussed about Iraq, which was how to deal with Iraq on a grand scale. This was really about it. And we went to planning Afghanistan. You can look at what we did. From that time on, this was about Afghanistan.
So when Mr. Clark writes that the president pushed him to find a link between Iraq and the attack. Is that right? Was the president trying to twist the facts for an Iraqi war, or was he just puzzled about what was behind this attack?
I don't remember the discussion that Dick Clark relates. Initially, he said that the president was wandering the Situation Room, this is in the book, I gather, looking for something to do, and they had a conversation. Later on, he said that he was pulled aside. So I don't know the context of the discussion. I don't personally remember it, but it's not surprising that the president would say, what about Iraq, given our hostile relationship with Iraq? And I'm quite certain that the president never pushed anybody to twist the facts.